I paid my guardian's bills for 7 years while my cousin did nothing. When I asked them to watch my son for one night, they laughed. "We're not your servants." So I cut them off. Days later, they were crying outside my house. I, 32M, never thought gratitude had an expiration date until my guardians laughed in my face and told me they weren't my servants. 7 years of paying their bills, covering their groceries, fixing their house problems, and this was what I got in return. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My parents died in a car accident when I was 15. My uncle and aunt took me in, along with their son who was 2 years older than me. They weren't rich people, but they opened their home to me when nobody else would. I was grateful then, and I stayed grateful for a very long time. Growing up in their house wasn't easy. My cousin got the bigger room, the newer clothes, the first pick of everything. When we both wanted to play the same video game, he got it. When there was only one slice of cake left, it went to him. His parents would tell me I should understand that blood comes first, and I did understand. I was just thankful to have a roof over my head. I worked my ass off in high school. While my cousin barely scraped by with C's, I pulled straight A's. I got a full scholarship to engineering school, while he dropped out of community college after one semester. My uncle would joke that I was trying to show off, but my aunt would quietly tell me she was proud. Those small moments kept me going. College was my escape. I studied engineering, worked part-time jobs, and sent money home whenever I could. Even with a full scholarship, I felt obligated to help with household expenses. My uncle's construction business wasn't doing well, and my aunt worked retail. Meanwhile, my cousin moved back home after his college disaster and spent his days playing video games and smoking weed in the basement. After graduation, I landed a good job with a tech company. The money was better than anything I'd ever seen. My first instinct was to help my guardians. I started small, covering their electric bill one month when my uncle mentioned they were behind. Then it was the water bill. Then groceries when money was tight. What started as occasional help became a routine. Every month, I'd transfer money for utilities, groceries, and whatever repairs their old house needed. When their car broke down, I bought them a used one. When the roof leaked, I hired contractors to fix it. When my aunt needed dental work, I paid for it. My uncle's construction business failed completely, and I became their primary source of income. My cousin never contributed a dime. He lived rent-free in their basement, ate their food, used their utilities, and somehow never felt the need to get a real job. He'd pick up occasional construction gigs through his dad's old contacts, but most of his money went to weed, beer, and gas for the car I'd bought his parents. I met Sarah during my 3rd year at the company. She was smart, funny, and didn't judge me for sending most of my paycheck to my guardians. When I explained the situation, she said family was important and she respected my loyalty. We got married after 2 years of dating, and I thought my uncle and aunt would be thrilled. They seemed happy enough at the wedding, but I noticed they spent most of the reception complaining about the venue and how my cousin didn't have a date. Sarah and I had our son when I was 30. Holding him for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. This tiny person was my real family now. My responsibility. My priority. But I kept sending money to my guardians because old habits die hard, and guilt is a powerful motivator. The breaking point came 3 months ago. Sarah had been invited to her sister's bachelorette party in Vegas. It was a long weekend trip, and she really wanted to go. We just needed someone to watch our 2-year-old son for one night, since I had an important client presentation the next day that I couldn't miss. I called my aunt first. I explained the situation and asked if they could watch their great-nephew for one evening. She put me on hold, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background. When she came back, her tone had changed completely. She told me they weren't babysitters, that they'd raised me out of the goodness of their hearts, but they weren't obligated to help with my responsibilities, that they were older now and didn't have the energy to chase around a toddler. But what really stung was when she said they weren't my servants just because I sent them money. I sat there holding the phone, trying to process what I'd just heard. 7 years of paying their bills. 7 years of covering every expense they couldn't handle. 7 years of making sure they never went without electricity, heat, or food. And asking them to watch my son for one night made me some kind of entitled master expecting servitude. I told her I understood and hung up. Then I called my cousin directly, thinking maybe his parents had misunderstood something. He laughed when I explained the situation. He said he had plans that weekend and couldn't be bothered with changing diapers. When I mentioned that I'd been supporting his parents for years, He told me that was my choice and didn't create any obligations for him. That night, I made a decision that had been building for months without me realizing it. I opened my laptop and canceled every automatic transfer I had set up. The utilities, the grocery money, the insurance payments, everything. Sarah found me at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at the computer screen. When I told her what happened, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me why I was surprised. She'd been watching this dynamic for years, seeing how they took my money without ever showing real gratitude. How my cousin lived like a parasite while I worked 60-hour weeks to support everyone. She said she'd been waiting for me to realize what she'd seen from the beginning. I didn't tell my guardians immediately about cutting off their financial support. I wanted to see how long it would take them to notice. The answer was exactly 2 weeks. My aunt called in a panic because their electricity was about to be shut off. She'd been expecting my usual transfer and couldn't understand why it hadn't come through. I told her there must have been some kind of banking error and I'd look into it. But I didn't fix anything. The next week, she called about the water bill. Then the grocery money. Each time, I gave her some excuse about technical difficulties or work being busy. I wasn't ready for the confrontation yet. The calls became more frequent. My uncle started leaving voicemails asking when the money situation would be resolved. My cousin texted me asking if I was having financial problems and needed to borrow money from them. The irony of that message almost made me laugh. 3 weeks after I'd cut them off, my aunt called crying. The utilities were being shut off. They were behind on groceries, and the car I'd bought them needed repairs they couldn't afford. She begged me to help them figure out what was wrong with the transfers. She said they were family and family helps family. That word, family, hit me like a punch to the stomach. I asked her if family was so important, why couldn't they help me with one night of babysitting? Why my cousin never contributed anything while living in their house? Why I was expected to bankroll their entire existence without any reciprocity? The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for almost a minute. Then she started making excuses. My cousin was looking for work. They were too old to handle young children. I was more financially capable than they were. Every reason except the real one, which was that they'd gotten used to taking without giving back. I told her the banking issues weren't technical difficulties. I had deliberately stopped sending money because I was tired of being taken for granted. The phone call ended with her hanging up on me after calling me ungrateful and selfish. That was a month ago. Since then, my phone has been blowing up with calls and texts from all 3 of them. The messages started angry, calling me heartless and vindictive. They escalated to desperate, with my aunt begging me to reconsider. My uncle sent long text messages about how they'd sacrificed to raise me and deserved better treatment. My cousin alternated between threatening messages and pathetic attempts at manipulation. I blocked their numbers after the first week. But yesterday, Sarah called me at work to tell me they were at our house. All 3 of them, standing on our front porch, ringing the doorbell continuously. She'd watched them through the security camera for 20 minutes before calling me. When I got home, they were still there. My aunt was crying, my uncle looked defeated, and my cousin was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching them through the windshield, trying to decide how I felt about seeing them like this. I thought I'd feel vindicated. I thought watching them panic about money would give me some satisfaction after years of being taken for granted. Instead, I felt hollow. These people had raised me, and now they were falling apart without my financial support. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. But then I remembered their laughter when I asked for help with my son. I remembered my cousin's dismissive attitude about changing diapers. I remembered being told I wasn't their master even though I'd been acting like their personal ATM for 7 years. I walked up to the porch and they all started talking at once. My aunt grabbed my arm and told me how sorry they were for the misunderstanding about babysitting. My uncle said they'd be happy to help with my son anytime I needed. My cousin, who'd never shown interest in being around children, suddenly claimed he'd love to spend time with his little cousin. The desperation in their voices was almost painful to hear. These were the same people who'd laughed at my request for help just a month earlier. Now they were promising me anything I wanted if I'd just resume the money transfers. I asked them why they'd changed their minds about helping with childcare. My aunt stumbled through an explanation about reconsidering their position and realizing families should support each other. I asked my cousin about his sudden interest in spending time with my son. He said he'd been thinking about the importance of being a good role model. The lies were so obvious, it was almost insulting. They weren't sorry about their attitude toward me or my family. They were sorry about losing their meal ticket. If I started sending money again, they'd go right back to taking me for granted until the next time I needed something from them. I told them I'd think about everything they'd said and would be in touch. The relief on their faces was immediate and pathetic. They thought they'd won. They thought their little performance had fixed everything and the money would start flowing again. After they left, Sarah and I had a long conversation about what came next. She asked me if I was really considering helping them again. Part of me wanted to. Despite everything, they had taken me in when I was 15 and had nowhere else to go. That had to count for something, right? But Sarah reminded me of something I'd been trying not to think about. Our son was watching all of this unfold. What kind of lesson was I teaching him about relationships and boundaries? That people could treat you badly as long as they cried hard enough afterward? That financial support came without conditions or expectations of basic respect. She was right, and I knew it. My son deserved better than growing up around people who only valued us for what we could provide. He deserved to see his father being treated with respect and dignity. He deserved grandparent figures who cared about him as a person, not as leverage for manipulating his parents. Update 1. It's been 2 days since they showed up at my house, and I've made my decision. This morning, I sent a text message to all 3 of them from a new phone number they couldn't block. I told them I appreciated them taking me in when I was 15, but our relationship had become too one-sided to continue. I wished them well and asked them not to contact me again. The response was immediate and exactly what I'd expected. My uncle called me selfish and reminded me of everything they'd done for me. My aunt sent a crying voice message about how hurt she was by my ingratitude. My cousin sent several angry texts calling me names and threatening to tell everyone what kind of person I really was. But something interesting happened after those initial angry reactions. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was my cousin's ex-girlfriend from high school. She'd heard about the situation through mutual friends and wanted to tell me something she'd never shared before. She said that during the years I was in college, my cousin and his parents used to joke about how easy it was to guilt me into sending money. They called me their personal ATM and would laugh about how grateful I was for the smallest acknowledgement. My cousin had apparently bragged about never having to work because his adopted brother would always bail them out. Hearing this from an outside source confirmed what I'd suspected but never wanted to believe. They'd seen my gratitude as weakness and my financial support as an entitlement rather than a gift. The teenager who'd been grateful for a place to sleep had become their retirement plan. Sarah found me sitting on our back porch after that phone call, watching our son play in the yard. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down next to me and took my hand. Finally, she told me she was proud of me for protecting our family and showing our son what self-respect looked like. I realized she was right. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about recognizing that some relationships are built on transaction rather than affection, and those relationships aren't worth maintaining. My real family was the woman sitting next to me and the little boy playing with his trucks in the grass. Update 2. A week later, I got a call from my aunt's neighbor. My aunt had given her my number for emergencies, and she felt disqualified. My uncle had suffered a heart attack and was in the hospital. The neighbor said my aunt was asking for me to come, but she wanted to give me a heads up about the situation first. The neighbor, Mrs. Chun, had lived next door to them for 15 years and had watched the whole situation unfold. She told me that after I stopped sending money, my cousin had been forced to find a real job for the first time in his adult life. He'd gotten work at a warehouse and was furious about having to contribute to household expenses. The stress of sudden financial responsibility had been causing daily arguments in their house. Mrs. Chun said she'd also overheard my cousin on the phone with his friends, complaining about me and making plans to take legal action to force me to continue providing support. He'd been researching whether he could claim I'd created a legal obligation by supporting them for so many years. The desperation and entitlement had reached levels that shocked even their closest neighbors. Despite everything, hearing about my uncle's heart attack hit me hard. Whatever our relationship had become, he'd been the closest thing to a father I'd had after my parents died. I drove to the hospital with Sarah, not sure what I was going to find or how I was going to feel. My aunt was in the waiting room when we arrived, looking older and more fragile than I remembered. When she saw me, she broke down crying and hugged me like I was her salvation. She kept repeating that she was sorry and that she needed me. My cousin was there too, looking uncomfortable in work clothes that still had warehouse dust on them. The doctor told us my uncle would recover, but the heart attack had been serious. Stress was a major contributing factor, along with years of poor diet and lack of exercise. He'd need medication, lifestyle changes, and regular follow-up appointments. The medical bills were going to be substantial. As we sat in that sterile waiting room, I could see the calculation happening in my aunt's eyes. This was her opportunity to guilt me back into financial support. A medical emergency that nobody could argue with. A legitimate crisis that would make me look heartless if I didn't help. But something had changed in me over the past month. I felt sad about my uncle's condition, but I also felt detached from their expectation that I'd automatically swoop in to fix everything. Their financial problems weren't my responsibility anymore, and a medical emergency didn't change the fundamental issues in our relationship. When my aunt started talking about insurance coverage and asking if I could help with the medical expenses, I told her I'd look into options but couldn't make any commitments. The disappointment on her face was immediate and obvious. This wasn't the response she'd been counting on. My cousin pulled me aside and asked if I was really going to let his father go into debt over medical bills when I had the money to help. He said that regardless of our other issues, this was about basic human decency. I told him that basic human decency was exactly what had been missing from their treatment of me for years. We stayed at the hospital until my uncle was stable and moved to a regular room. When he woke up, he looked genuinely happy to see me. For a moment, he was just the man who'd taken in a scared teenager and given him a place to belong. But then he started talking about being grateful for family and how crises show you what really matters, and I could see the manipulation starting again. I told him I was glad he was okay and that I hoped he recovered quickly. I also told him that his health scare didn't change the boundaries I'd established for our relationship. The hurt in his eyes was real, but so was my need to protect myself and my family from further exploitation. Update 3. 3 weeks after my uncle's heart attack, I received a certified letter from a law firm. My cousin had apparently found an attorney willing to argue that my years of financial support had created an implied contract or legal obligation to continue providing assistance. They were demanding that I resume monthly payments or face legal action for breach of implied agreement and abandonment of dependent relatives. The legal threat was exactly what Mrs. Chun had warned me about, but seeing it in official letterhead still felt like a punch to the gut. These people were actually trying to force me through the courts to continue bankrolling their lives. The gratitude I'd once felt for them being willing to take me in was completely dead now. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, who read it and started laughing. He said it was one of the most ridiculous legal theories he'd seen in 20 years of practice. There was no precedent for forcing voluntary family financial support to continue indefinitely, especially when the recipients had explicitly refused to reciprocate even basic favors. He offered to respond with a letter explaining why their case had no merit. But I had a different idea. Instead of having my lawyer respond, I decided to call my cousin directly. When he answered the phone, his voice had a smugness that made my skin crawl. He said he'd hoped we could resolve this without lawyers, but I'd forced his hand by being unreasonable. He actually used the phrase, forced his hand, as if he was the victim in this situation. I asked him if he'd thought through what would happen if this legal threat actually went to court. A judge would have access to financial records showing exactly how much money I'd sent over the years with no legal obligation to do so. They'd see that I'd asked for one favor in 7 years and been laughed at and insulted. They'd see that he'd lived rent-free in his parents' house as a grown adult while contributing nothing to household expenses. The smugness in his voice started to fade as I continued talking. I told him that if he wanted to make this a legal matter, I'd be happy to provide documentation of every transfer, every payment, every time I'd covered their expenses while he sat in their basement smoking weed and playing video games. I'd show the court exactly what kind of gratitude I'd received for my generosity. By the end of the phone call, he was backpedaling frantically. He said the lawyer had probably overreacted and maybe they could work something out privately. I told him there was nothing to work out. They'd made their choice when they decided to threaten me with legal action instead of accepting my decision with grace. I hung up and immediately called my attorney to have him send a response to their lawyer, not just explaining why their case lacked merit, but also putting them on notice that any further harassment would result in us filing for restraining orders and considering counter-litigation for attempted extortion. 2 days later, my aunt called from a different phone number, crying and begging me to call off my lawyer. She claimed she didn't know about the legal threat and that my cousin had acted without consulting her or my uncle. She said they were scared and just wanted to fix their relationship with me. I told her that if she truly hadn't known about the lawsuit threat, she needed to ask herself what kind of person she'd raised in her son. A man in his 30s who thought he could legally force his cousin to support his parents so he wouldn't have to get a real job and contribute to their household. She started making excuses for him, saying he was stressed about money and didn't think clearly when he was upset. I realized that even now, even after everything that had happened, she was still enabling his behavior and refusing to hold him accountable. Some patterns never change, no matter how much damage they cause. That was the last conversation I had with any of them. My attorney sent the response letter, and we never heard from their lawyer again. The legal threat had been exactly what my lawyer predicted, a desperate attempt to intimidate me into resuming payments without any real foundation in law. Final update. 6 months have passed since I cut off financial support to my guardians. My uncle recovered from his heart attack, though I only know this through Mrs. Chun, who still updates me occasionally on their situation. My cousin is still working at the warehouse and apparently complaining constantly about having to support his parents. My aunt has gotten a part-time job at a grocery store to help make ends meet. They've had to sell the car I bought them and downsize to a smaller apartment. It's not a comfortable life, but it's a manageable one if they're willing to live within their means, and my cousin continues contributing his fair share. The financial crisis that seemed so dire when they were outside my house crying has been resolved through the same means most people use: actual work and realistic budgeting. Sarah and I have started putting the money I used to send them into a college fund for our son. It's amazing how much we can save when we're not supporting 3 additional adults who refuse to take responsibility for their own lives. Our son will have opportunities one never had, funded by money that used to disappear into a bottomless pit of entitlement and ingratitude. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being too harsh. These people did take me in when I was 15 and had nowhere else to go. That kindness meant everything to a scared teenager who'd just lost his parents. But I've come to understand that gratitude doesn't have to be eternal servitude, and past kindness doesn't excuse present exploitation. The most important lesson I've learned is about the difference between family and relatives. My guardians and cousin are relatives, people connected to me by circumstance and legal arrangements made when I was too young to have a choice. My real family is Sarah and our son, the people I chose and who chose me back, the people who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. I don't regret cutting them off, but I also don't take any joy in their struggles. I hope they find a way to be happy with the life they can build through their own efforts. I hope my cousin learns the value of work and contribution. I hope my uncle stays healthy and my aunt finds peace in her new circumstances. But I won't be funding their journey anymore. I have my own family to protect and provide for now. I have my own son to teach about boundaries, respect, and the difference between helping someone and enabling them. I have my own future to build without the weight of carrying people who see my assistance as their right rather than my choice. Looking back, I realized that the scared 15-year-old boy who was grateful for any kindness grew into a man who confused obligation with love and guilt with loyalty. It took becoming a father myself to understand that real love doesn't come with invoices, and real family doesn't require payment plans. My guardians laughed when I asked them to watch my son for one night, saying they weren't my servants. They were right about that, just not in the way they meant. They weren't my servants, but they weren't my family either. They were people who'd confused my gratitude for weakness and my generosity for stupidity. The day they stood crying outside my house, desperate for money, was the day I finally understood the difference. And for the first time in 7 years, I chose my real family over the people who'd been using me. It was the best decision I ever made.